I know a lot of you guys got your ADHD diagnoses like later in life, but if you can think back to childhood and experiences that you had that maybe you connect now to having ADHD, how do you think having ADHD may have impacted your development of BPD, or think that it's maybe related in some way?
I think there were a lot of a lot of times where I felt like it was harder for me than other kids to do what we were supposed to be doing. I've always felt like I've been controlled by what I call creative demons, where whatever they want me to be working on is what I have to do. I can't do anything else than that. So a lot of the times it's drawing or thinking about making something. And I mean, now I can see that's kind of tied back to the ADHD, but that I found was sort of used in an invalidating way, because people would say things like, well, you're very clearly able to focus on your art, so you don't have a focusing issue. You just don't want to focus on other things. And I go back now and I read what my fourth grade teacher wrote, and it's very obvious. It's like textbook ADHD. But for whatever reason, I think at the time, people did not really think about it as dysregulated attention. They just thought about it as a complete inability to pay attention to anything ever. So if you ever showed signs of being able to focus on something, it wasn't your problem. And so I think that invalidation absolutely played a role in developing BPD, because I felt like there was something different and something wrong with me, but no one was really pointing it out in a way that helped me develop skills to deal with it. And so it wasn't really overt, horrible, mean things. It was just everyone else seemed to be able to do things, and they weren't able to reach out to me and help me in a way that actually would work. And I think that kind of led to a lot of the maladaptive coping that became BPD later.
That sounds very similar to how you talk about your BPD diagnosis too. It's like, if people don't think that you're always in crisis, then you must not have BPD, right? Like, it's a similar idea of, I think, just like stereotyping mental health, right? And what it should look like. And if it doesn't look like in this extreme way, then there's nothing to work on. Whereas we actually all as human beings have shit to work on, and we're not perfect in every way.
And even that word inattention, I don't identify with that. For me, it's hyper attention. I feel like I'm trying to pay attention to too many things at once, and my brain is like, oh, this is interesting, this could be interesting, what about this other interesting thing? Rather than not paying attention. And similarly, I mean, I'm like Zanny, so I have also the hyperactive side of things. So then I also, always want to do new things. And what's this new shiny thing that we could do? And and what about this? And then there is the extreme, right? We haven't talked about the hyper-focus side. And I feel like BPD overlaps with that. And for me, from an emotional side, like the ADHD will be like hyper focused, and then the BPD will be like on shame today, something like that. So I feel like they overlap there as well. But yeah, it's like this constant roller coaster of like, either I'm trying to pay attention to everything at once and I can't seem to pay attention to anything at all, or I'm hyper-focused, zoned onto one thing, and literally the world could end. Like, I once wrote for 7 hours straight, didn't do anything. I was in a hotel room by myself. I was solo traveling in Luxembourg, and at 2 a.m, I'm like, oh my God, I'm still right. It's 2 a.m. What? What happened?
Yeah, I think going back to your question, Alex, I think for me, I always tell this story in my skills group to my clients of when I was, I think 8 or 9, I went to a summer camp, and my whole hyper focus at that time was the Spice Girls, everything about the Spice Girls. And so I wanted to be a Spice Girl, and everyone in my camp group or whatever was going to be a Spice Girl with me. And the other kids were just like, who is this kid? Like, I'm not into this. I don't really want to do the Spice Girl thing. And, looking back on that, I always think about the DBT thing. We talk about like being a tulip in a rose garden, where I was just always kind of like a bit of a different kid. And, there are always going to be people I don't really mesh with or fit in with, and that's okay. But at the time, I really interpreted that as like, gosh, I'm weird. Other kids don't like me. Like, I'm just not going to fit in, which is just fodder for BPD for sure.
I was just always so enthusiastic about so many different things. And so I was doing like all these different activities and sports. And at home, my mom would like help us to make like a little newspaper. And then I had a cutout of like a TV, and I would like do the news and the weather every day. And, I was just like that. So like just doing and being. And I loved being on stage, and I did dancing as a kid and stuff like that. And so a lot of my peers, all of my peers really, started saying things like, too loud, too much, who does she think she is, and all this kind of stuff. And I was completely excluded and ostracized like from my peer group. And that was really hard, because I definitely took it to mean like, okay, I'm too much, which means I'm not good enough. And therefore, from this point forwards, I need to I need to look at how other people are behaving around me and try and be like them, so that I can fit in and I can have friends and I can be, normal, quote unquote. And that became my mission. And I did that for 20 years. And I do think, back to Alex's question, that, there's definitely a connection there with the BPD, for sure. Because when you're trying so hard not to be yourself, and you have, in the end, like when I had my BPD diagnosis, at that point, I had no idea who I was. What music do I like? What food do I want? I had no idea. I had so many different masks.
From my side, my feelings of abandonment and neglect was so strong from an early age that actually desire for attention and for focus on me meant that I switched and jumped and moved between various things just to try and be a people pleaser. So I wouldn't necessarily focus on my own interests and what was good for me. I would desire to sort of please others and would jump into various things. I would, scoop up and vacuum up as much culture, as much interest as possible, so that I could be involved in conversations, in sort of parts of people's processes and part of people's thoughts. I was a complete contradiction of, being a rugby player, but also doing ballet lessons and doing dance and musical theatre and stuff like this, which, sort of meant that I got picked on by quite a few of those groups, but it meant that actually I got attention from people. So it was sort of that desire, and what it laid on to later life is sort of just this, what would be called an info freako. I'm just constantly vacuuming up focus and information and stuff like that, because I think it looks better on me that I have this knowledge of many things as possible, so that I can be involved in conversations, so that I can discuss with people, so that I can sort of be part of people's lives, and just sort of, it's kind of a weird mix of that desire of jumping around various things just to gain that attention.
Yeah. I think a lot of us overcompensate in certain ways. Like, I've totally become a perfectionist because I think my whole childhood it was like, you're not doing this right, you're not, it's like I think I've just overcompensated so much for them. Maybe that's why I ended up in a PhD program. I wanted to prove something to people. I don't know if that's necessarily the truth. I love what I do, but it could be a part of it. Like, just pushing myself really hard because I want to, I don't want to feel like that child who was always like the one in class who didn't understand things.
This question about like ADHD and BPD roots and overlap, and I struggle with this a lot because I don't remember a lot of my childhood. I kind of forget a ton. I don't really remember how I used to feel. But I also the abandonment stuff was also there from a really young age for me. And the people pleasing was there from a really young age. And that transcends to my insecure attachment styles now and how I am in relationship now. I don't prioritize my needs. It's always prioritizing other people's needs because I don't want them to leave me. Right. And I don't associate with I feel like a lot of people with ADHD kind of associate with having a lot of energy, acquiring a lot of knowledge, thinking really quickly, kind of moving faster than everybody else. And I was always slower. Like my brain just moves slower. I take information in slower. I process things slowly. My output is slow. If I'm expressing myself, it's usually slow and it takes a lot of effort. And that always made me feel kind of inferior. Like I've always felt that my like intelligence was different from the people around me, and not like less or more, but just different. And that I was more like emotionally intelligent or just like attuned to the world in different ways. But that always like, you know, when all of my peers were just like getting assignments done, doing things, being in activities, like just being really active, I was like always very inactive and very slow. I always felt too slow for society.
I have always felt like it's one extreme or the other. I never feel like I'm moving at the same pace of other people. It's either that I'm moving much more slowly or I'm moving so fast that I don't understand why other people can't keep up.
The other thing I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but for me, like through school and also even now, I use anxiety to get stuff done. And sometimes it's good because I actually end up getting stuff done. But sometimes obviously it has a knock-on impact, because then I'm in like that spiral of, oh my God, I need to do this thing, otherwise it's the end of the world, when actually no one is waiting for this thing. I just made up this story in my head. And similarly at school, like I need to sit down. I can't, I need to mold myself into what the world wants me to be. And using a lot of anxiety, like self-driven anxiety kind of talk to get there.
I think that's where the BPD counteracts quite nicely for me, because if I do feel like deadlines and stuff, it's my personal shame or my guilt or sort of not wanting to look bad to the world that will try and also when I was saying about responsibility, I want to take on responsibility because I think that's the way to try and get the best out of the both worlds, maybe at times with, sort of deadlines and things. So I think sometimes the BPD can counteract it quite nicely.